to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Charles Derber, Professor of Sociology who has taught at BC since 1986. Professor Derber's research and teaching involve a critique of globalism and corporate power and the prospects for a shift toward a more democratic order in the U.S. and in the world. He is the author of 11 books, including Corporation Nation, Regime Change Begins at Home, People Before Profit, The New Globalization in an Age of Terror, and my favorite title, The Wilding of America, Money, Mayhem, and the American Dream. His op-eds have appeared in Newsday and the Boston Globe, and he's been interviewed extensively in the media, including in Newsweek, Time, on NPR, and Fox National News. He's also active in many grassroots movements on campus and off campus, including the labor, peace, and global justice movements. Tonight he will talk about his new book called Hidden Power, What You Need to Know to Save Our Democracy, which was published by Barrett Kohler. And Larry Weinhardt, the author of Wag the Dog, said of the book, Derber offers the real scoop on money, war, power, and moral values that the mass media refuse to report. And he gives a step-by-step agenda for how to defang the bloody warriors of Washington and Wall Street. Please join me in welcoming Charles Derber.
Thank you very much. Can you hear in the back? I wander, so I'm not going to rely on this mic. Eduardo, can you hear me way back there easily? Yeah? Okay, good. So thank you so much for coming out. Many of these are sort of captive audience students of mine who have had to, who are taking midterms tomorrow. They're going to be very surprised to see me use, if I can figure out how to do this. Why did my title disappear, Gene, from the, it touches it and it goes on? I'm very excited about trying this. I'm moving into the 21st century here. My students who have never seen me, nobody in this room has ever seen me use PowerPoint because I've almost never done it before except on rare occasions. So I thought it might be a way to move a little bit more quickly through what I want to say, and my students know that I'm most passionate about dialogue. So when I'm done jabbering here, I would like to have some conversation, which is always the most interesting part of these presentations. In this book, the idea of hidden power is, I guess, an image that I like to use is that the media focus on politicians. And a lot of progressives, I think, focus on Bush, thinking that if we could get rid of Bush, all of our problems would be solved, and America would be back to its glory days. And the way I think about it is this, that the politicians are very important. And what the media does is when you read the newspapers or watch TV, what you see are the faces that are bobbing above. I'm going to use, with Katrina much on my mind, a nautical metaphor of water in a lot. So what you see are these heads bobbing on the water. And it's true, you should see these individuals and these faces because they play an important role in running the country. But just beneath the surface of the water, you know, these faces are connected to bodies and the feet stand on something. And underneath, you know, where the TVs don't focus their lens is a structure. And politicians stand and are firmly planted on that structure. I call that structure a regime. And I think that, to get right to the point, the hidden power in the United States is the structure on which the politicians of both parties stand. And if you ask the question, who really rules America, I think it's not George Bush, it's not any of the politicians, it's a structure, it's a system, which includes the politicians, but is a much broader, deeper force. And it makes life more difficult for those of us who would like to see change in the country, because you can't just get rid of a particular individual or even a particular party, because the leaders of both parties have their feet on the same structure underneath the water. They are part of the same regime. They're on different parts of the regime, and it makes a difference. I'm not saying it's irrelevant which party is in power, but what I'm saying is that if you want to see really meaningful change, you have to do more than simply change the individual in power. So what I want to do is really say, let's imagine that we turned the camera and we had an underwater camera, and we looked at the structure that these politicians are standing on, the structure that's actually guiding the direction of the nation. Because then I think you learn something about the real power dynamics and the real interests that are being served by the government. Regimes, let me see if I can master the first thing here. One way to think about a regime is as a house. I'll use an architectural metaphor here. And it's every regime, and now I'm sort of giving a structural description of what this under-the-water system looks like. It can be characterized as having these 5 pillars. First of all, every regime has a dominant institution, which I call the foundation of the house. It has a particular mode of politics, which determines how the house is run. It has a social contract, which essentially sets the terms for the tenants. It has a foreign policy, which dictates the relation to the neighbors, and an ideology, which spells out the creed of the household. Now, let me say that I want to go in and talk about the current regime running the country, because it has distinctive pillars. But what I want to say about this architectural metaphor is that every one of the houses that has run America is a capitalist house. So these architectures are not dissimilar from each other. We're not talking, American history is a history of a story of regimes and regime change inside the United States. So I believe, and I don't believe that historians have ever used quite this kind of analysis. I think real change happens in America when there is regime change in America. But no regime change ever in America, except possibly for the revolution, has been revolutionary. That is, it has not fundamentally changed the capitalist order. So why do I worry about changes in these regimes at all? Because the actual configuration of the architecture does make a difference. When you shift, and I'll try to say briefly how, when you shift from one regime to another, which since the Civil War has happened only 5 times, you get very important change in the country. But you don't get revolution, and you don't get an end to capitalism. But you get important changes in the ideas of the country and in the way the country is organized. Let me, well, I don't put here, let me just use one other image for thinking about what a regime is. A regime is not only a house, and I guess this would fit more in the context of ideology. The thing that is very compelling about regimes, and I think to most people make it most clear, is a regime is a system of thought. If you want to use Orwellian language, it's a form of controlling thought, or a system of thought control. What a regime does is establish at any given period in history what are the ideas that are legitimate to talk about. Which is to say, a regime is inside your head. Right? It is structuring the organization of your brain. And certain ideas in any given period of history are imprinted as appropriate and reasonable ways of thinking about the world by a given regime. When regime change happens, it's important because the fundamental way that your thought process takes place changes. But I do want to point out that regimes, if you say, why should I care about a regime? Well, one, because the regime is running the country and determining pretty much what a president does. And second, it's shaping the way you think. And my view is not that you can't think outside of the box of what the regime says, but if you do, you will be disregarded. You'll be viewed by the media, by the mainstream organs that shape the schools, and there's just a delimited way in which thought becomes acceptable under the conditions of a regime. Since the Civil War, there have been five regimes. Let me just very briefly run you through a history. I think I'm centrally interested in talking about what I call corporate regimes because we live under one today. And a corporate regime, I'll say in a moment what I think characterizes a corporate regime. But the first regime lasted from the Civil War to McKinley's assassination when Teddy Roosevelt came in. And I call it the first corporate regime because for the first time, the modern corporation came into existence in the United States and basically reshaped the whole nature of the country. Everything from the way government worked, to the way the economy worked, to the way people thought, the way the Supreme Court operated. Everything changed in that period. I'm going to move very quickly through this because, like I said, I want to make change for conversation, but I just want to give you a sense of the historical overview. Regime change took place after the 1890s when there was a period of extreme economic turbulence and financial disarray. And there was a regime change that was brought in by Teddy Roosevelt, which I'll call the progressive regime. It lasted 20 years. It's one of the most complicated regimes to understand because it's a regime that was very dominated by corporate interests at the same time that it opened up the sort of door to certain kinds of reforms that threatened some of the existing structures during the robber baron period, the first corporate regime. In the 20s, you got the second corporate regime. Big business came into power with a vengeance under Harding and Coolidge and Hoover, and the country was once again run very much in the image of the corporation. The business of America became clearly business, and the mass religion of the culture became consumerism for the first time. Mass consumerism was constructed, and the idea of happiness in America became an idea about the mall and about shopping and consumerism. This regime had a short life for a lot of, although it's a very interesting regime because it has many, many striking parallels to our own. When the markets crashed in 1929 and Roosevelt came in, we got a regime change which led to the New Deal. Clearly the most significant regime change in American history, in my view, other than the revolution. It lasted quite a long time. It offered ordinary people something that most of the corporate regimes up to that point had failed to offer. It is interesting to note that Roosevelt himself took a long time to begin to make the changes that created regime change. Roosevelt, when he first came in, wanted to run the country and solve the problems of the Depression by letting corporations pretty much manage their own affairs, an idea that was inherited from Hoover. Now, I mention this just because whenever you shift from one regime to another, it's very hard to change the fundamental ways of thinking of the country. Roosevelt was in many ways a Hooverite for a few years. It was only because of extremely radical action on the streets and in the factories by workers and by tenants whose furniture were being thrown out of their homes in New York, and then people in the neighborhoods were coming back in and bringing those things up and fighting the police. There were all kinds of things going on the streets that suddenly, well, not suddenly, over time, forced Roosevelt to sort of empty his brain of the way of thinking that had been imprinted by the second corporate regime and to turn to a new way of thinking. And it took a long time, which is to say the regime change is very difficult and slow because the ideas that get imprinted in our slow brains are very tough to change. It takes a long time to get the fundamental kind of change in thinking that leads to an actual regime change. The New Deal had much glory and did a lot of very important things for people. But like all regimes, it ran into contradictions, many of its own making, that led to the rise of the New Right, which began after Goldwater's defeat and the South realigned as part of the Republican Party. And the modern corporation created in concert with the religious right a very different kind of political order. That created what I call the third corporate regime. It's the regime that we operate under today, so I want to say just a little bit more about it. Okay, I went to Washington looking up in the archives of the Smithsonian to find the birth certificates of various regimes. And after scrupulous research you would expect of a Boston College professor, I dug up this sheet of paper, which is the official birth certificate of the regime. Gives the basic demographic data, name, third corporate regime, date of birth, election day, 1980, father, Ronald Reagan, mother, corporate America, headquarters, Washington, D.C., current presider, George W. Bush. Okay, that's, this regime is purring along. It's run into a lot of trouble in recent days. A few indictments that might come in over the next week could shake the regime even more deeply. But this regime has had a remarkably powerful impact on the country and on you. Now, let me just say a word about a corporate regime and then talk about what this regime has done. A corporate regime is fundamentally a regime that melds together corporations and the government. To the point, if you look at Bush's cabinet, for example, virtually every member of Bush's cabinet has been a major player in a Fortune 500 corporation. Cheney and Bush themselves were both CEOs. They obviously come out of the oil industry. Most of his cabinet and his regulatory agencies are staffed from the companies that, that they're supposed to be regulating. Now, it's interesting that traditionally many people on the left have said that a system of government that unites corporations and governments is fascist, which I think is fundamentally incorrect. And I will speak a little bit later about fascism and why I think this particular regime is not fascist, although it has the potential, if there were a regime change, to move in a rightward direction that would look a lot more like fascism. It looks a little bit like fascism already. But a corporate regime essentially eliminates, in practice, although not in rhetoric, the distinction between the corporation and the government. They become a monolith. You create, if you think about that structure under the water, it's essentially a good carpenter has sort of hammered together the structure of corporate America with the structure of the political elites in the country. And what you have governing the country is not, you have essentially, I mean, it's hard to fully understand this, and it's part of the invisibility of this structure. What do you call a structure that is essentially founded on the marriage of the political class of the country and the economic dominant elites of the country? Because that's what we've had over the last 25 years. You don't elect the corporate elite. You elect, one of the things that's really peculiar about a corporate regime is that it legitimates itself as a democracy using democratic techniques while eroding the substance of democracy. The most important things legitimating the third corporate regime are elections. But the things that are most eroding the real substantive democracy of the country is the way elections are used in this country. So it's important to recognize that, and this makes a difference from fascism. Fascist systems are by their nature undemocratic, even though Hitler came into power democratically. Corporate regimes have all of the appearances of democracy. But the fundamental bottom line of corporate regimes is that they're not run by you and me. And, you know, this is a very, very widespread understanding in some way. If you ask most people, do you feel you have power in running the country? Most people say, I don't have any power. 50% of Americans roughly don't vote. They don't vote in large measure because they say it doesn't make a difference whether I vote. And I think they're saying two things. One is that the elections are to some degree shams. Elections are not really shaping or changing the way countries are run. And if you take this analysis true, people who say that are largely correct, since both parties are basically operating out of the same regime. They're going to implement more or less the same policy. And elections are essentially legitimating the idea that we're living in a democracy. What democracy does today, I think people have kind of given up on any real idea of democracy. Very few people believe anymore that ordinary people run this country. And I think they have sort of understood this regime analysis without having a language for clearly articulating it. So the current corporate regime is characterized by the following. If you just go back to the architectural metaphor that I talked about. The foundation of the house, the dominant institution, is the transnational corporation. These are huge entities. As you know, the largest corporations are larger than most nations. You know, Walmart has 2.5 million workers. GE is bigger than Finland in terms of if you compare its sales to GDP. These are huge entities, and they operate in the realm of politics as much as they operate in the realm of economics. I call the mode of politics of this regime corpocracy. You can gather where I invented that word from. It melds together corporation and democracy, right? So it's a political system that is organized on the basis of corporate money and corporate power, but operates legitimately in the name of democratic procedures. It's legitimated by elections. So it offers democratic procedures, but it delivers, by its design, the design of the House, non-democratic outcomes. People don't have a chance. The social contract of this regime has become increasingly insecure for ordinary people. That is, people's ability to hold on to their jobs, to any basic social contract that was going to protect them, is eroding. It's very important to note, because it has to do with the potential right-wing turn of a regime change, that the foreign policy is a full-blown global empire. We're talking about hegemonic global empire as an inherent nature of the regime. And the ideology is complicated. I'll call it the corporate mystique, which sort of says that people cannot imagine a world without corporations. That corporations somehow are the foundation of both prosperity and democracy, when in fact, to a large degree, corporations are eroding both. We've had this regime for about a generation, and the question is, what is going to happen to this regime over time? Remember, my fundamental argument, and just to make it clear again about what I mean about regimes as systems of thought control. If you think about Bill Clinton, he's a member of this regime. Bill Clinton was more conservative in many ways than Richard Nixon. How to think about this? Because obviously, Richard Nixon, a conservative Republican, was a much more conservative figure than Bill Clinton. But in practice, the two, I mean, it's almost like Dick Nixon looks liberal or socialist compared to what people are able to do in politics today. Why is that true? Nixon came, to go back for a second to the regime chronology. I really want to see if I can operate this backward as well as forward. Okay, so we're back to here. Nixon came at the end, in the twilight years of the New Deal regime. The New Deal was beginning to fall apart. But Nixon was still bound by the discourse, the thought system of the New Deal. So it was extremely difficult for Nixon to do what he would really like to do. And Nixon talked about things like a minimum income tax which would maintain a kind of minimum standard of living for all Americans. Bill Clinton would never have been able to embrace that and didn't. Nixon introduced occupational safety and health and safety regulations. He introduced various kinds of environmental things. Clinton dismantled 130 different government programs. He talked about ending welfare as we know it. He talked about small government. A liberal Bill Clinton sounded, thought, and talked more conservatively than a very conservative Richard Nixon. Why? Because regimes set the boundaries of what presidents can say and do. So the New Deal regime forced even a very conservative president like Dick Nixon to stay within the boundaries of the discourse of the New Deal regime. The third corporate regime, our current regime, forces liberals like Bill Clinton to stay within the discourse and boundaries of the range of respectable thought that defines this regime. So recall that in some ways the personal values and thoughts of the leaders don't matter very much. What matters is the constraints that are established by the regime on what the president and all people in Washington and you and me can express and get accepted as legitimate thought. I just want to go back to the idea that in the end, a regime is a system of respectable thought. And you can only think within the boundaries of what that regime introduces as acceptable. Okay, so I'm going to move forward here and talk about how regime change can happen. At some point, if history is any guide, every regime in America will crack up and there will be regime change. It's never not happened. And without getting into any great detail, basically what happens is that cracks begin to open in the regime. Just in a class today, I asked people, and people immediately suggested there are two obvious things that can crack a regime open. One is major economic crisis that can't be patched together. The Depression brought Roosevelt into power. When Teddy Roosevelt came in, the financial crises of the 1890s were very significant. The other thing, when I talk about military cracks, is collapse in war. Losing a war is a great way to catalyze a regime change. And so wars play very central roles in the chronology of regime and the creation of regime change. There are a lot of other things that can come into play. Cultural cracks are very, very important. For example, the current regime is a very, very historically anomalous regime. It is constructed by a melding of the corporate right and the religious right. Now, this is an incredibly interesting and unusual and unstable coalition for a regime. The reason, of course, is that corporations have always been in opposition. Corporations have had their root in Wall Street and the North. The right has had its root in the South, and the religious right, and the Bible Belt. Historically, there has never been a point, at least till after the Civil War. I mean, maybe you saw some accommodation before the Civil War. But since the Civil War, these two forces fought each other, and ever since, they've been on the opposite side of the scale. The great and startling development, which happened after the election in 1964, when Goldwater was elected, is that for the first time since the Civil War, in 100 years, it brought together the corporate right and the religious right. Now, and it's quite obvious, I asked this in my class today, I said, do these two really go together? Are these two groups which have the same interests? Give me a quick show of hands. How many of you think that the corporate right and the religious right share the same set of political and social interests? It's unanimous, almost, yeah. It's obvious that they're fundamentally unstable, but they've been stable as partners and building up the power of this regime for the last 35 years. A really interesting question is there a cultural crack that you're beginning to say for around the issue of stem cells, for example, where in Missouri you've got very powerful biotech companies which are trying to get into the biotech game and into stem cell research that are being heavily opposed. These are Republican companies in a Republican state being contested by the religious right base that doesn't want to see stem cell research. There's many, many examples of where corporations and the religious right are in trouble. So, are we at a point of regime change in America once again? The truth is, I've got no obvious way of answering that question. Social scientists are terrible prognosticators. So there are three options, it seems to me, and I want to just conclude with a discussion of what I see as the three options that are before us. One option is that the current very obvious cracks in the regime, particularly the level of debt and the almost bankruptcy in the economy, the great economic and social crises for the average American worker, the huge growth in the gap between the rich and the poor, the incredible collapse in Iraq, the exposure of the corruption and the lies of the Bush administration, which have come to symbolize so much the nature of this regime. There are all kinds of things that could blow this regime out of the water. But it's also quite possible, because like capitalism itself, regimes tend to be very resilient. It takes very big deals to destabilize a regime. So one possible option is that the regime will limp along in its current model, and that you'll see a continuation of this regime for some time to come, and you won't see any dramatic change in the country. You can elect a John Kerry or a Hillary Clinton, and the Democratic Party will get in, and nothing really fundamental will change. The regime will be happily going on underneath the water. The structure underneath the water will remain very, very substantial increases in American forces, which is a little bit of an indication of how much the leadership of both parties is on the same, is on the same place in terms of the regime. Now, there are two other options, and I'm sort of interested in the conversation whether you think we're at a period of potential regime change. And remember, by regime change, I don't mean whether Bush will be knocked out of office. I mean whether when he is knocked out of office, whether you're going to see a fundamental change in the actual structure of governing power in the country. The first option is the regime limps along in an increasingly weakened state until something dramatic changes. At some point, the regime will crack. There's no doubt about that. And there will be a regime change. The second option is a scary one that a lot of people think about, which would be a right-wing regime change towards something which I describe in the book as fascism light. It's not classical fascism. It's nothing like really classical fascism, but it has characteristics that are recognizable as having a kin. Now, we already know that the current regime is a union of the corporations and the Bible Belt, the religious right. It's a very odd thing. I'm going to make a few references to Germany here, which I've been looking at much more deeply lately to talk about some of the possible parallels that might make possible this really scary shift. If you think we're in a right-wing era now, you can't imagine what it might look like if we got a genuine regime change to the far right. We're already in a far-right era. It could get a lot worse. We had a discussion in one of my classes this afternoon. Some of the students are loyally here about what fascism was. And what I think accurately we came up with was the idea, I don't know how many of you can define fascism in your own mind, but what we came up with was the idea that fascism is a system of highly concentrated power, but there are a lot of, all dictatorships and all tyrannies are not fascist. People have a tendency to say anything they don't like politically is fascist. It's not an accurate way of thinking about fascism. Fascism is, interestingly, a system of extremely concentrated and violently repressive power, often in the form of a dictatorship. But interestingly, it's a system of extremely repressive power tied to an extremely idealistic moral agenda. Fascist regimes come with a story with two chapters. This is familiar to me because we were just talking about this in class this afternoon. The first chapter is moral decay. The country, in any kind of fascist regime change, the structural conditions that are necessary are some sort of fundamental dissolution of the country, a sense among large parts of people in the country that something has gone terribly wrong and that the country is falling apart. What happens in a successful fascist regime change is that people running the country on the right succeed in a narrative, a resonant narrative that speaks to very substantial traditions. This is not just propaganda. The left has largely misunderstood propaganda. It's not just lies, it's not just propaganda, it's resonant propaganda. It's propaganda that resonates to the cultural traditions of a large sector of the country. In this case, in a fascist regime, we're talking about certain forms of lies, propagandas, and myths that would resonate in the South and the heartland of the country in a very powerful way, and we're already seeing examples of it. The nature of this story that would be resonant and would pull the country to the right, because fascism moves on a very idealistic story, is this. First, moral decadence. We were talking this afternoon about the fact that in Weimar Germany in the 20s, you had an incredibly vibrant cultural revolution. It involved a rise of women, gays, artists, personal expression, and freedom, all linked to the development of urban cultures in Germany that were full of progressive, social democratic, communist, often Jewish people who were involved in the arts, in the universities, in all kinds of artistic, cultural, sexual experimentation. It was one of a period of a great flowering of German culture. Of course, it was deeply, deeply threatening to traditionals in Germany, traditional values in Germany, which were rural, based on ideologies of blood and soil, a German nationhood, which was based on a simple, non-urban, non-secular, and non-intellectual German peasant. The great writer about this is a guy named George Mosse, M-O-S-S-E, who has documented this element of fascist ideology very, very powerfully. What a successful fascist regime succeeds in doing is tarring the people who might change the regime to the left as subverters of the moral and spiritual integrity of the nation. So what the right in Germany did was take, and it wasn't too hard. If you've seen, how many of you have seen the movie Cabaret? Okay, it was a play and then a movie. And you could see the sense of decadence in that play. It showed a German sort of beer hall play, theater, where there was a tremendous amount of sexual expressiveness. Sexuality, by the way, plays an extremely important form in the control of all, both corporate and fascist regimes. Because all of these systems are about control of ideas, thought, and desire. Free sexuality threatens, because sexuality is something that's very hard to manage, it threatens the stability and control that is very, very important to repressive regimes. I should say corporate regimes are very schizophrenic on this issue of sexual desire and sexuality, because capitalist culture depends on the endless elicitation of desire of all kinds, including sexual desire. So capitalist corporate regimes, on the one hand, are deeply involved in the cultivation of sexual desire. On the other hand, sexual desire is destabilizing culturally. And it's become a major central part of all extreme right-wing and fascist regimes that view women and gays and other forces that seem to be challenging traditional sexuality as the source of fundamental threat to the nation, the source of moral decline, and essentially the undercutting of the spirituality and moral fiber of the nation. So what you got was, by 1932, there were 5 elections in Germany, and Hitler never gained, the far right never gained more than 37%. 2/3 of German culture at the time that of the German population at the time Hitler took over was progressive. It was voting either social democratic, communist, or central, one of the center Catholic parties. But through a series of legal, political deals worked out by the German right, which included the landholding traditional Prussian aristocracy and the German capitalist elites, who concluded that, scared as they were of Hitler, that a deal that would put the Social Democrats or the communists in power was far more frightening. So they made a deal with Hitler. They said, we'll put Hitler into power and we'll control him, which was what most of the German corporations and traditional German aristocrats thought they could do. They were deadly wrong. Hitler made short shrift of them. But that was a deal that they made. Now today, I want to point out one other thing. The idealism of fascism is that it will restore to the country the spiritual vitality of the nation. When I reread Mein Kampf, which is Hitler's great prison story about what he's going to do for the country, Germany, I found myself, and I'm a person who had family killed in the Holocaust, I found myself uplifted, inspired by a lot of this, even though there's a tremendous amount of racist, vituperative junk that's just spewing out in Mein Kampf. It's fundamentally an incredibly charismatic piece of work. And what it does is it points out the decline of the country, and it offers an incredibly enticing and seductive vision of how to create rebirth in the country. Hitler promised to have Germany born again. And the theme of having decay and then being born again is the fundamental mythological theme of fascism. Now, I want to jump very quickly just to how this could play out in the United States. Once again, we've had a period that's sort of like Weimar, of 60 years of culture, not 60, more like since the 1960s, 30 or 40 years of genuinely dramatic cultural change in the country, particularly in regard to women, gays, sexuality, religion, and freedom of expression generally. The very thing that the right calls moral decline reflects one of the great periods of moral progress in the country. Fundamental rights have been extended to large parts of the population that have been denied it. Certainly in the 1950s, all those groups were in a fundamentally different place. So remember that morality is always a social construction. I don't know if you believe in universal morality, but in the political sphere, morality is always relative. So what the right calls moral decay is what the left defends as moral progress. Nonetheless, when moral change takes place on a very rapid basis, it can be an incredibly powerful backlash when used skillfully by the right. I think the whole politics of moral values in the United States today is an effort by the right to essentially claim, as was done in Germany, that the decline of the country, that is the ordinary economic, healthcare, fundamental ordinary needs of people that people are struggling with in this country now, are being caused by people who are subverting the fundamental moral, sexual, family, religious, and nationalist spiritual integrity of the country. What's happened is, and it's frequently the case in right-wing regime change, that the internal dissidents to the regime, whether they're social democrats or Democrats, are viewed as essentially morally equivalent to enemies outside the country. The enemies who destroyed Germany were the same as the communists and the social democrats who were a fifth column from within. Today, the democratic establishment on the East Coast in places like Boston College and on the West Coast in places like San Francisco are being equated in the heartland and the South as somehow equivalent to terrorists, moral terrorists who are subverting the integrity of the country. So I think it's very powerful when you think about the possibility of a right-wing regime change when you link the internal dissidents to the regime, left-wing Democrats, popular movements, and so forth, as traitors who are making, perhaps unconsciously, common cause with terrorists outside the country. The only thing further I want to say about this is that this is a classic right-wing formula. You can go back in history and see this kind of moral political discourse that is now hugely part of the American political discourse about what's happening to moral values in the country. It is absolutely classic of periods of right-wing regime change. So if one worries, now, so you have in place, when people are in part of a politics which is focused on essentially the collapse of the moral and spiritual foundations of the country, and then you get a subway attack by a terrorist in Boston or New York, and you get a series of them, just as the Reichstag burned down. And you have in the Constitution, as you do in something like Article 40 or 50 of the Weimar Constitution, emergency powers given to the Chancellor or the President, which say under a condition of emergency, when somebody is fundamentally threatening the moral integrity or spiritual identity of the nation, the President can invoke emergency powers to legally suspend anything in the Constitution or the legal system. There's nothing in this country, in the Constitution or the President or the law, that the American President cannot suspend under an emergency declaration. And of course, as you know, a lot of the debate about the Supreme Court right now is whether John Roberts and Harriet Mier believe that, and they have spoken as such in their internal memos, which is why Bush is not eager to release those memos, to essentially affirm those president's emergency powers. And the president has already used emergency powers in relation to the Trader Act. He's used it in relation to Katrina. You probably know some of the ways in which the emergency, the declaration of Guantanamo, all of the issues about torture in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he might use it, there's talk about using it on avian bird flu, for example, where, again, you can put the country under martial law and under national emergency, which any of these things, all of which are being discussed and two of which have already been put into play, can essentially undermine everything in the Constitution. There's nothing in the law or the Constitution that can prevent the president from doing this. The president can only get away with doing this, I think, in a right-wing thing, when you have this kind of moral discourse around the fundamental subversion of the moral values of the country, where a large part of the country has been persuaded that there is an internal fifth column that's prepared to subvert the fundamental values of the country. Okay, let me move on and conclude with the question of how does the left deal with my facility with my, here we go. Here we go. I said there were three options. The regime could stabilize itself, patch things up. It's like a scientific theory of patching up theories, anomalies in a scientific theory, and restrain itself. It could take a regime change to the right, or, I'm covering all my bases here, you could get a progressive regime change. The disaffection with the Bush administration, which is not exactly the same as the disaffection with the regime, but the Bush administration has increasingly come to be identified with control in the country. You can just obviously look at all the things that are bringing Bush's poll numbers down to where Nixon's were during Watergate. If we get indictments on Rove and Libby, which might open up questions about the vice president's role in, I mean, this is all, of course, about the story about what happened in going into Iraq. All these indictments are important only because they bear on the fundamental issue of criminality in relation to taking the country into war. That's an impeachable offense. So it has significance. I'm sure all of you are looking with interest on what is going to happen. But whether it happens or not, there are at least all of these things that are going on that are fundamentally eroding the legitimacy of the current administration. I think you probably all saw it yesterday. I think it was ABC that ran a poll imagining there was an election today and Bush lost by a very large margin. And it's worth saying, as you probably all know, that while the majority of Americans define themselves as philosophically conservative, on specific issues from Social Security to Medicare to the environment to the war in Iraq and so forth, a very robust majority of Americans oppose the Bush administration and take a fairly progressive position. Now that, of course, doesn't prove anything because the same was true in Germany in 1932. Majority of the German population was progressive, and you still got a fascist regime change. So the very fact that you've got a majority of the population, remember, politics under these kinds of regime governance do not operate on the basis of public opinion. And governments constantly do things which are at odds with the majority of the population. Nonetheless, this produces a certain openness for a progressive regime change. Now, despite all the sort of despair that might be emanating from this presentation, the book that I just wrote actually has a lot of fairly optimistic views about how a progressive regime change might take place. I don't think it's going to take place immediately. I think it's going to take either a more severe economic crisis, conflict with China that might get the Chinese to stop buying American bonds. There's all kinds of scenarios you can imagine that could ratchet up the economic crisis. You can also imagine crises in the Middle East that would make the American situation there even more untenable. By the way, I think there is, in response to some of this, everybody says, well, things have gone so bad in Iraq, Bush couldn't possibly invade Syria or destabilize Syria or other countries in the Middle East. I think that's wrong. Bush tends to respond to these kinds of situations in ways that I think you can imagine that there is going to be a substantial destabilization both of Syria and Iran as potential ways to create the nationalist backlash that would keep the regime stable or move it to the right. Nonetheless, I think that there are many, many reasons to believe there could be a regime change to the left. The regime is old. 30 to 40 years is very old for an American regime if you just look historically. The crises that this regime cannot patch up and the legitimacy of the regime as a lying, deceptive regime out of touch with the needs of ordinary people has become very apparent to a very large number of people. The problem is that there is no, and there are, I should add, there are very substantial, localized grassroots groups all over the country who would like to create regime change in this country. Noam Chomsky says that the level of political action in the country at the grassroots on a progressive basis is as strong or stronger than at any point in the 1960s. And I suspect that may well be true. So there is a lot of ferment out there in the land. And there are a lot of conservatives and Republicans who don't like big corporations for a lot of different reasons, part of which is they're being screwed by the big corporations in major ways, and people don't like being hurt. However, based on what I've just said, the key problem politically is that John Kerry and Hillary Clinton, the two most likely Democratic Party candidates, and the whole mainstream of the Democratic Party is sitting firmly on the structure under the water of the corporate regime. So you can elect a Democrat, and you're not even near getting a regime change. You're just getting a cosmetically more attractive corporate regime. Therefore, what's only going to create a regime change is when the Democratic Party extricates itself. It jumps off its comfortable perch on the corporate regime and moves in the direction of creating regime change, which may seem very implausible if you know anything about the Democratic Party. But I want to just quickly talk about two things. One is, and the last slide I want to show you is just what I think, how that X is going to be. I want us to talk just a little bit about the issue very much on people's mind. To the extent that a right-wing regime has elevated conversation about moral values to the center of politics, what do Democrats do? What does a progressive party do? Particularly in the line of, remember that a winning strategy is a resonant strategy. It's got to resonate to a very substantial part of the American population. A lot of that population is moving south, lives in the South. And the moral discourse in the South and the whole history of the South is very, very important to think about in this slide. You know, the majority of the population are not living in the Northeast, and they're not living on the coasts. So it's a very important thing to deal with. I think that the Democrats have no choice but to make a bold move to take back control of the moral discourse of the country. And in a way, that should be very obvious. Probably a lot of the people here are progressive people, the great majority of people in this room. And they are progressive because they are fundamentally driven by moral passion. The left has been very reluctant, partly in the name of scientific language. It goes right back to Marx, who claimed himself to be a scientific materialism. Marx didn't like to talk too much about the language of morality because there was a theory of scientific materialism. That's shaped the left. There's also a therapeutic discourse on the left. The left is much more comfortable talking about health and illness than good and evil or good and bad and so forth. There's a lot of reasons why the left restrains itself, some of them good reasons, from bringing sort of intense moral discourse into politics, and certainly religion into politics. But I think that there's, you know, remember, regimes are systems of thought control. And the thought control in politics today has become heavily moralized. And morality trumps everything when it's been effectively inserted into politics. Living wages look trivial as language, or changes in healthcare policy, when you're talking about the survival of God, the survival of the family, or the survival of the nation. God, family, and country. The big challenge for the Democratic Party, and maybe we can talk about this, is how to take back control of a moral discourse that's been so centered in a resonant way on God, family, and country. Now, there's some easy ways to start. The Bush administration, which is currently symbolic of the regime, is going through one of the great moral explosions or implosions in history. You know, you've got delay, you've got Frist, you've got every form of crony capitalism, you've got the lies in Iraq, you've got so here's a regime claiming moral credibility that is going through one of the great moral implosions. How can a regime which claims to represent the moral and spiritual essence of the country stand on a position of moral values when it's being indicted? Every one of its major officials is being indicted, right? There's certainly a ground to begin with to say this regime has no basis for making an argument about being born again as a moral nation. And I think the Democrats can easily expose that kind of thing, or not just Democrats, but progressives more generally. Now, then it's incumbent on the Democrat to offer its own moral public discourse, which is too big for me to get into here, except I think the two fundamental themes I'll just throw out to you. And I think these are resonant, they can sell in the South and the heartland as well as in the North, are the ideas of inclusion and community, or inclusive community. I mean, religion, nationalism, and family can run on inclusion or exclusion as moral categories. The Constitution, I mean, I'll ask you, is the American Constitution fundamentally an inclusive or an exclusive document? Questions for you to think about. But I think you can make the case either way, but one can make a powerful argument, particularly in thinking about the United States as an immigrant nation, which put forth the rhetoric constantly of inclusivity in contrast to Europe, at the very moment that it was constantly practicing a politics of exclusivity, that the ideal of inclusiveness is very, very central to the moral center of America's national creed. The second idea is the idea of community. America, of course, is a hyper-individualistic country. So you might say, where does community come in? But the truth is, if you look at the research on the rise of evangelical Christianity, one of the things that seems to overwhelmingly come out is that people go to these mega churches in Colorado and Arizona and so forth because they find a huge mall where they can send their kids for school, they can shop, they can meet other people and talk about drug abuse and mental health problems in their family and alcohol and drugs in the schools and so forth. These mega churches are sources of community they're not finding anywhere else. Americans are hungry for community. Community is based on ideas about solidarity and coming together, which have always been powerful on the left. But the left has never been able to sort of develop a discourse of community that has really compelled the country. But, as Americans, quote, as Harvard's Robert Putnam likes to say, bowl alone, a lot more. The demographics say that the biggest burgeoning household structure of the country is single people. The plurality, the most common form of household in America are single-person households. Not single-parent, single-person. Okay? So there are all kinds of new issues about community and inclusion that are very, very central, and on which I think these right-wing exclusionary ideals, and the right is very conflicted about the idea of community, because the churches bring community, but the economic and social ideology of the evangelicals and the Christian right is very, very individualistic. And in fact, the religion itself redefines morality purely as a conduct of the individual. And of course, part of what the change in the moral conversation has to be is to redefine morality so that it goes beyond individual conduct. Most of the country was comfortable with the idea that Clinton could be impeached for what he was impeached for because it was personal conduct. Bush could not be impeached before a war in Iraq because it's not seen as personal conduct, even if it's lying. So there's a kind of incredibly controlled discourse about morality that the progressives have an opportunity to challenge, I think, effectively and do. Then I think what happened with Katrina opens a door. It's been shut right now again pretty quickly, but there's still that door for the concept of building an economic and social agenda founded on the morality of inclusive community. And the reason is you saw in the headlines in the floods that there were a bunch of black poor people who were not included. They had been abandoned, triaged, left to die. And it shocked people all over the country. And I think it opened up a reality that all this talk about America as a land open to, the Statue of Liberty, beckoning immigrants from all over, multicultural acceptance and so forth, is still very far from reality. And progressives can build on that moral discourse of inclusion and community, and that Katrina offers an opportunity for really moving that moral conversation and then fleshing it out with extremely powerful, non-regime-based proposals. If you want inclusion on Medicare or medical care in general, there's a lot of easy ways to implement that moral ideal into a policy that's not a regime policy, that is within the current regime. It doesn't have anything to do with corporate-oriented medicine. If you want, Social Security is already an inclusive social policy that has been embraced by the country. You can go on and on. The public likes inclusion in its economic and social policies. It does not like to see people left out, even though the right offers all kinds of reasons why the poor should be left out because of their own moral failures. Can any of this happen, particularly in the context of the possibility of a new set of terrorist attacks that would probably push forward right-wing regime change? I mean, the biggest danger in my mind right now is the likelihood of a series of Madrid or London-style attacks that will greatly facilitate the movement toward a right-wing regime change. National security, martial rule will be declared, and you could get the conditions in the context of this moral, intense politics that would produce the country really in a scary way to the right. But the left, remember, Katrina has opened up something, and so would terrorist attacks, actually. The whole moral discourse of the right and its leadership is based on kind of quasi-feudal ideas about protection. People want to be protected. The Bush administration rates still high on only one thing, which is terrorism. They think that Bush protects them from terrorism. And so Katrina and a bunch of other things is making people feel they're not being protected, whether it has to do with bird flu or it has to do with their health care or it has to do with a range of other things. So there's a possibility to act on this. Just basically, I don't think the Democratic Party is going to move outside the regime. And again, if you look at the New Deal, what moved the Democratic Party was social movements on the ground. So the real question is social movements that came together and were able to ultimately reshape the political process. France came together in the 30s and created a united front, which produced a socialist government in France at the same time that Germany was going fascist. What happened in Germany was an insane policy by the communists, which said that, following Stalin's orders, which said that the communists should never create a united front with the Social Democrats because we want Hitler to come into power. This was coming out of Stalinist left. We want Hitler to come into power to create a catastrophe for capitalism that would open the door for a communist revolution in the country. Absolute insanity. But it created a very characteristic fragmentation on the left that made a united front impossible, and that creates, you see still today, a tremendous amount of fragmentation and inability of progressives to come together. And you're going to need to find some way in which the social movements, which are really the catalysts of all the potential progressive possibilities in the country, and there are a lot of people in this room who are deeply involved with these progressive movements, whether it's on campus or off campus. That is the most hopeful, only thing that is going to save this country, are the people in this room and not in this room who are going to be part of those movements from the grassroots up. That's what moved Roosevelt. That's the only thing that will move the Democratic Party. It's not going to come from inside Washington. And so, in a way, the possibilities of hope are all tied to the future of these grassroots movements and their ability to ultimately reshape the Democratic Party or the party system more broadly. Third parties, fourth parties at the local level that will be able to somehow move local politics, where you're seeing a lot of change already, into a different kind of movement on the national level. I talked a lot longer than I should have. I'm going to shut up and invite you to raise a few questions before my students who are taking midterms tomorrow have been very patient here. So let me stop there and invite you to raise a few questions. Yes?
Do you think Lincoln made a big mistake by forcing the South to stay in the Union?
Well, this question, can you guys hear the questions all right? Yeah? He said, did Lincoln make a big mistake by forcing the South to stay in the Union? I've asked myself that question. It reminds me of the question of, was a historical tragedy created by the fact that the Americans actually won their revolution from the British? I have a number of friends who say the world would have gone in a very different trajectory if the Americans had lost, the British had maintained control, slavery would have been ended 50 years earlier, the Indians would have had a much better deal, and you wouldn't have had the rise of American empire quite so rapidly as it developed. This question about the South, you know, I think we are refighting the Civil War in some ways. I think whether we go left or right depends on whether the culture of the South trumps the culture of the North. They're two extremely different cultures. And I think the red-blue divide is not a complete fiction in the sense that, I mean, there's a lot of fiction about it because the majority of Americans on a huge array of issues, whether they're from red states or blue states or red or blue, they share a common view on both economic and moral issues. So there's a lot of fiction. On the other hand, the moral legacy of the South, which the South is basically a pre-capitalist feudal culture, which operates on issues of militarism and national honor and race in a ways quite different than the North do, which is most fundamentally, I mean, there are a lot of leftists who romanticize Jefferson, who was part of a Southern culture, which was incredibly repressive in many ways, and have trouble understanding Hamilton and the Republicans as one of the progressive forces in the South, but it happened to be, you know, very much consistent with Marx's idea. You know, the Republicans were the bearer of capitalism, and it took capitalism to overcome feudalism in the South, but it didn't really overcome feudalism in the South. There's still a fundamental character in the South of cultural pre-capitalist things, which is very dangerous because fascism grows out of the cultural soil of blood and soil, which is still very much a force in the South. So I can't answer that question. All I know is that the dynamics between the North and the South are still, from a cultural point of view, are still very, very powerful. Of course, you've also got elements of capitalist culture, particularly energy, the military sector, and so forth, which has united both North and South very clearly under capitalist systems. Yes?
I see economics as being much more
Significant control.
ominous
Oh, okay.
point that's going to take us. That is, within the next 10 years, we will not be able to care for the baby boomers. There are too many. So we all know that the healthcare system is set up completely wrong. We should be more like Europe and the rest of the world, but it's such a mammoth, interconnected monolith at this point that that's going to come to a head, whether we like it or not. It's going to happen in 10 years.
Right.
And China has already announced that they have every intention of taking care of their 200 million people who are in dire poverty before they take care of the debt of the United States. So they have basically already announced. And so I think these two things are going to come to a head in the next 10, over the next 10 years. When it happens, 5
Right.
years, 10 years, but it's going to happen sometime in the next 10 years because the debt won't be able to be financed
Right.
and the health care won't be able to be provided and the people will not stand for it, and therefore major change has to come. The other moral part of it that I think you've missed is the role, and I think it crosses red and blue states, is the idea of immigration. And the fact that it's been wonderful that we've had so much immigration these last 30 years because we're not going to be like Japan and Europe where, you know, such a high percentage of the population is going to be old. We're going to have, you know, we're going to shift from average age of 34 to 37, not a big deal. But it has eroded the moral fabric of the society, and I believe most people have believed that because people come in illegally, nobody says anything. People hire illegally, nobody says anything. There's a moral breakdown of obeying the law on a lot of different levels that I think liberals, conservatives, moderates are all very angry about, and that's the issue. I think more than the gays, the you know, single families.
All right, well, let me speak to that very briefly. The economic situation, I agree, is likely to get worse. On the other hand, you know, in Germany, the economic situation was 10 times worse than it is in America, and there was a right-wing shift. I mean, the collapse, I mean, there have always been progressives who believe that the key to a progressive victory in the United States was economic collapse. I'm not suggesting that you're saying that, but I...
No, I agree that it could go either way.
Yes.
It could go to fascism or it could go to progressive.
Okay.
But there will be a major shift.
I agree that it's likely that the economy and the economic situation is going to get much more intense. And one hopes that that will produce, I mean, that Jeb Bush is pushing through this new Medicaid program in Florida right now, which is privatizing the Medicaid system in Florida and is going to cut lots of poor people in Florida out from any Medicare. I mean, Jeb Bush is important because he's probably the future of the Republican Party, and what happens in Florida will be interesting in terms of how some of these issues of social and economic despair play out in the culture. But clearly, everything I've been saying about morality should not leave you with the impression that I should say that I'm thinking that the Democratic Party or progressives should abandon a very, very strong economic message. The economic message remains central, precisely because economic conditions are very difficult and because it's where the left and progressives and the Democrats have by far their greatest margin. There's no question. And even if you reanalyze the 2004 elections, the economic issues played very, very well for the Democrats in 2004. Well, before I go on, let me just try to get more questions that are, yes, go ahead.
To me, Katrina seemed more like a logistical failure independent of party or regime. So I was just wondering what exactly, if you could just explain to me more about Katrina's impact on your argument, basically, please.
Well, I mean, I don't know whether Katrina will have a lasting impact, but the issue of black poor people in cities has pretty much disappeared from American politics. And Katrina brought it onto the television screen. I mean, the closest way I would say it is that in Vietnam, body bags kept coming home every night. And the image of body bags coming home reshaped public opinion about Vietnam. You could not eat dinner during the 60s and not turn on the TV and see body bags coming home. What they've learned in Iraq is you never show a body bag. You'll never see a body bag coming home from Iraq. Have you? Yeah, that's a very deliberate thing by the Defense Department, because that imagery, I think politics works on subconscious visual imagery. So since 9/11, the basic governing imagery of American politics has been planes flying into buildings. And that is the one core structural support of the Bush administration. People say it over and over again. In people's minds, subconsciously, the image of buildings, you know, the Twin Towers being hit by airplanes. I mean, that was played on CNN 1,000,000 times. And so, now, with Katrina, it's not quite the same visual thing, but there was a very powerful new visual image that was sort of getting pushed into the American consciousness. It was those people in the Superdome. They were all black, they were all poor, or very large percentages of them, and they were living under extremely, you know, they looked like they were a third world refugee population. By the way, I just have to mention this because I just saw it the other day. How many of you have seen the movie The Constant Gardener? Please go see this film if you haven't seen it so far. I've mentioned for it. I mean, just because, for one thing, it gives you and offers you a visual imagery of global corporate realities in Africa around healthcare that are, it's also a thriller and a wonderful, if you like Hollywood thrillers, you like this movie. It's a John le Carre film. But it's also an extremely compelling thing. Katrina was visually very dramatic, particularly during the first few days of the storm when people weren't showing up. So it put the image of black poor people in cities back onto a political landscape which by a regime, the regime has subsisted partly on marginalizing black poor people out of the moral equation. They don't exist. They're not talked about negatively, they just don't exist. So I just think it opened a window, let me just leave it at that, where people could suddenly say, if we're going to be an inclusive community in America, we got to think about those people. Yes?
It seems to me that the black poor are also big in the South and those red states in the
Yes.
Bible Belt. So how's that fit? That they would be so, they feel abandoned by the government, but yet they're the ones voting for that government?
Well, I think that's another reason. The Gulf Coast is the Deep South. The Deep South is Bush's base, right? All this bungling and this inability to protect. Remember, protection in the South is absolutely central. It's the central feudal pre-capitalist moral category. You're prepared to sacrifice yourself in exchange for protection. So these storms in the South are blowing apart the image of a protective state that Bush has created. So there is, I think, there is in the South the possibility that those people on the Gulf Coast who are going to lose their livelihood and lose their cities and towns and so forth, and where there's no real security still in large parts of the South because all the National Guards in those states are over in Iraq, that is going to open up space for political conversation. I mean, Howard Dean, after he was appointed head of the Democratic Party, he says, I'm going to camp out in the Deep South for 4 years. I mean, the Democrats have recognized that the South is the poorest part of the country, that the economic issues involving trade and outsourcing and so forth are cutting in the South very, very hard. And so if you can start getting people to think about moral categories of protection in relation to the economy and things that the Bible Belt values like loyalty and community and being rooted in a particular area, that area is being ripped. And it's lost its some protection. So there's some possibility there, yes.
What do you think the role of the media, because you mentioned how regime change comes with, the restructuring of thought of the people of the country. How do you think the media plays a part of that? Do you think they have an influential role on the one hand on the people and on the other hand on, passing on the view that the government wants?
Well, one of the dominant things about this current regime is for the first time in history, it corporatized the media fully, right? All major media are owned by corporations. And just as in, the thing about the same with healthcare, increasingly with schools, increasingly with the military. Why this third corporate regime is so amazing is that there's no part of American life. Museums are being corporatized. Universities are being corporatized, right? Every institution is being structured around the image of the transnational corporation. BC is thinking of itself as a transnational corporation, and everything about BC is moving in the sort of image of a transnational corporation. International education means transnational corporate education. So the media reflects, the media has a market, and it's governed by people who want to see profit margins in every sector of the markets they're operating under. And they're infused. Remember I said regimes are systems of thought control. The thought control operates through, in modern culture, largely through the mass media. And so the mass media play a very central role. And it's a challenge because the media is very much infused with the fundamental thought patterns of the regime. On the other hand, there's the internet. There's all kinds of alternative media. We have a great media thing at BC here. There's a fantastic proliferation of media possibilities. So I wouldn't want to Some of the best progressive grassroots work being done today is on the media. So I wouldn't want to discount that. Yes?
Kind of along the same lines of bullets 3, 4, and 5 there. Excuse me. It seems to me that you need to get people off the sofa to be able to kind of build these movements, to
Yes.
get them active and participating again. And in order to do that, I wonder if you could comment a little bit on, it seems like you need to do that first before you can tackle bullets 1 and 2, which, and I wonder if you could talk then about how campaign finance reform potentially plays a role in being able to get the corporate message, get to the point where the corporate message isn't the dominant voice in electoral politics, and allowing people to have a strong say and to build up those progressive movements.
Well, if you look at the right, how did it do it? It worked up from the grassroots. It had a lot of money from the top, and there was this incredibly coordinated financial turn. I'm thinking about the rise of the New Right in the 70s. They built foundations in Washington, all kinds of things. But they used the churches in the communities as a way to activate their base, right? The preachers talk, the people listen. You create these mega churches, you create these evangelical centers. They are the sort of New England town hall for a large number of people in the South and the heartland, right? What is the progressives' equivalent of the mega church? Do you have a thought about that?
Universities.
Okay, universities. We're on a campus, right? I mean, this is why I'm here partly. I feel like campus, if you look historically, campuses have always been incredibly central. And if you're worried about right-wing regime change, I've said this in things about protest on this campus when there have been problems with it and so forth. The university is the institution that lives or dies on the basis of free speech and dissent and all the things that are fundamentally anti-fascist. I mean, the university was one of the first institutions. They got one of the most powerful philosophers, in the country in Germany and signed him up to the Nazi cause and shut down or killed or purged all the professors and academics who didn't get on board. It is incredibly important to defend the university as a source of critical thought and independent political action. And there's a great deal of progressive action on American campuses. So the campus is one very, very important thing. It was true in the 60s. It's true today. But there are a lot of others. There are a lot of very progressive religious denominations in the country. There are, there's all the groups, the minority, the women. There is no shortage of bases for people coming together in a progressive way in this country. A lot of it is, I think that the left has been plagued by, it doesn't have the financial resources of the right. It has been plagued by its own inability to find its morally resonant voice, partly through its own problems, because people are incredibly passionate on the left, but they don't know how to express that passion in a moral sense. And the left is very individualistic. And I think that really cuts in to its ability to come together in this way. David.
On Friday, day after tomorrow, at the State House in Vermont, there will be a large gathering to talk about secession again. Since Vermont was an independent country for 14 years. The question I have is, what role does secessionist talk about the breakup of the country have in regime change?
Well, I think secessionist talk is still on the margins of American politics. And I don't know the answer to that question. Do you have an answer? Do you think that it is going to, there is talk of impeachment, and I think that in the light of potential indictments and the incredible crisis of lies and moral transgressions of the administration that really are serious, I think impeachment serves a very useful role. Secession strikes me as probably far less productive. It's different than localizing, for example. Mm-hmm.
And with the oil crisis now, New England being the most dependent upon foreign oil and so forth of any region of the country, can our policy be the same as other regions of the country? And the West Coast seems to be different in various respects than the upper Northwest.
Yes.
So I wonder whether some change in the federal system might be in store.
Yeah, same question they're raising in Iraq right now. I mean, David, you've been a leader in getting people to think about much more local autonomy. I think the strongest case for that is that the most progressive things going on in the country are happening on the local level. Mm-hmm. And it's where local, there's, how many cities, David, that have now come to saying that they renounced the war in Iraq and that they have, on environmental issues and global warming, the whole range of issues, it's the localities, the cities, often big cities, that have led the way on that. So I think there is a case for a strong, but I just want to caution that with the reminder that power operates globally. And the great crisis of the left in the at least last 30 years has been that all of this dynamic stuff that goes on at local levels in cities, which has been going on for a long time, does not coalesce into a powerful national politics. And I think that has also got to change. I think we'll take one more question because people got to go home. Yeah.
Doesn't this country really need a strong third party in order to enact this regime change? It seems like Democrats are completely lost right now.
So the question is, don't we need a strong third party? We need something different than the current Democratic Party, that's for sure, and the current Republic. They're both sitting on the same thing. So there are two possibilities, and they're not mutually exclusive, right? In fact, I think they should probably, and this goes along with David's question about locality. I think that if you're going to have a regime change, you have to have a regime change in the Democratic Party. We have two parties of business right now. So how do you create regime change in the Democratic Party? Well, there are two possibilities. And they probably are not mutually exclusive. They probably work together. One is you create local politics that are very strong and build politically at the local level, and that probably involves third parties at the local level. You know, in Madison, Wisconsin, you can find people on the city council who are Greens or other, and you build pressure and support up from the grassroots in that way. Now, does that lead to the idea that you want to create, as some people have talked about, Andy Stern with the SEIU, who's broken away from the FFL. There have been a variety of people who talk about third parties nationally. I think that the way that they do it in New York, where there are some interesting third parties, where they run these fusion campaigns, right? Where you run independent candidates for your third party at the local level, but the state allows you to put the same person as the Democratic candidate onto your national ticket is not a stupid way to approach this. So I think, you know, the key issue is, you know, we're never going to get significant change in the country with the Democratic Party as it is. And by the way, there's another very strong parallel with Germany. The Weimar Republic, which was the period from 1919 to 1933 in Germany, was run by a completely exhausted social democratic party. It was a complete failure. It couldn't rule. It had no ruling vision. And it was really a tragic outcome. I mean, it was the collapse of the Social Democratic Party that led to Hitler in many ways. And, you know, we have a kind of Social Democratic Party, a much tamer one, that is equally vacuous, that simply doesn't have any kind of persuasive economic or moral vision that is speaking to people. So I think that the parallels with Germany here are very, very strong. So when you talk about a third party, I think, God, do we need a different party system here? But I don't think that simply creating a third party is going to solve this problem, given the way the political structure of the country is set up. I think you guys have been very patient. Jean, I think we should let people go home. And thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it.